Anand. Welcome so much to the Impact, our podcast at the Esya Centre. Thank you so much for making the time.
Of course. Good to see you, Megha.
Anand is Vice President at the Asia Group, where his clients focus on technology and financial services. And he is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, where he analyzes Indian tech policy specifically. So he's a great guest for our show today. Anand and I are going to talk about if ideology and technology, what is happening in that space. And Anand, just to set it up a bit, I want to talk about, we've seen a lot of face-off and tensions between US and China under former President Trump, and that a lot of that has continued under Biden as well. Similarly, there have been face-offs between India and China, and India even banned a whole bunch of Chinese-owned companies and apps and things like that. And now we're seeing the Chinese government put up all sorts of regulations, crack down on different sectors, tech-related sectors, which are really impacting investors globally. So I just want you to take a step back and talk about what's going on over here globally. Is ideology driving policy today? Is that what we're seeing?
Well, it's a great question. And, the short answer is yes. Ideology, or more broadly, domestic and international politics, is increasingly at the heart of tech policy and driving tech policy unlike ever before. And in my view, there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is this greater understanding by political leaders and policymakers of the value and influence of digital technologies, not to mention this growing interconnection between the physical and digital worlds, right? The old barriers between the analog world and the online world are eroding, faster than I think many folks would have predicted. We're spending more and more of our days online, and this is only accelerated during the pandemic. So controlling the technologies that mediate and ultimately shape this new hybrid reality, that's a central priority for governments. And that's true if you're a democracy like the United States, India, or the European Union, but it's doubly so and absolutely vital for autocratic states, right? Like China or Russia, where ultimate authority rests on societal control rather than popular legitimacy at the ballot box. So, I think there's that greater awakening amongst political leaders is probably the first reason. The second reason, I think, is that technology is increasingly shaping identity. We can kind of intuitively understand this at the level of the individual in terms of, the things that we post, the platforms we have to use, the content we share, the things we buy. All of these are markers and makers of our own individual identity. But now let's take that one person and then zoom out to the level of a country. Governments are making those choices to build a digital ecosystem that ultimately reflects the national values they champion. So in Europe, that's expansive defense of civil liberties and privacy. In America, it's a commitment to innovation, entrepreneurship, and independence. In India, it's this focus on a combination of equity, inclusion, sovereignty, and self-reliance. And so these forces are all kind of bubbling together. And I'd say the third key reason as well is that tech companies are increasingly making value-driven decisions that are forcing them to come to terms with their own ideologies and their own power. And we saw this most acutely with President Trump's, the ban on President Trump, the content kind of takedown decisions that social media companies are making. But every day, these companies are making decisions that are ultimately infused with values. It's making them question the operating principles by which they act with. And they're ultimately responding to pressure from publics, governments, even their own employees. And so it's forcing big tech and every tech company really to come to terms with what is our own ideology.
Anand, you said a bunch of really fascinating things, and I'm going to unpack them and put you on the spot piece by piece. So one of the things you mentioned was autocratic governments, and also how governments are focusing, they're awakening, right? So can we narrow that down specifically to India? And what do you see with the Indian government? Are we seeing a similar awakening over here? And how is that playing out? And my second question is, you mentioned, a lot of these companies are being driven by their values, including values of their employees. How does that play out overseas? Specifically, how is that playing out in India? Are we seeing that sort of demand over here, or we're just not in that space yet, and it's other factors that are driving their policies or their decisions in India?
No, those are two great questions. Let's start with the first one, which is I think in India there's this greater understanding, particularly with this government and I would say the state in general, that technology is something that you have to exert control over it as a government, or potentially risk losing your agency, your ability to shape the information space. And it's also coming from it from the perspective of the state being a fundamental guarantor of constitutional liberties, while at the same time trying to balance this tension between foreign actors that are quite active in this space. Who do you have a responsibility ultimately to serve here? And I think that's where I think the Indian government has staked out a pretty clear position where they're trying as much as they can to protect Indian citizens, particularly around these issues of privacy. But at the same time, there are these new tools that are emerging, and we've seen this most recently with Pegasus, that is in many ways giving, I think, unfettered access in the bureaucratic space to new tools of surveillance and new powers that I think even the government hasn't necessarily fully wrapped its mind around, in terms of what happens if these are applied and used kind of at a really quite wide scale. So in India, there's this whole notion of digital sovereignty that I think, cuts both ways, both in terms of empowering the government as kind of this, core actor within India's digital ecosystem, while at the same time also driving, policy shifts around at the regulatory level that are playing out and kind of shaping the operating environment for multinational companies, but then also consumers in this market. To your second question on, I'd say the values of kind of Indian values and how does that shape decision making? I think it increasingly does, right? Where companies are realizing that they have to take almost a country specific approach, or that this whole notion, while you can have these kind of almost universalist company values and whatnot, there I think we're increasingly finding that they're having to modify that to local landscapes, to local tastes. And I think as India continues to become a core digital market for many of these companies, the influence of the employees who work there, the policymakers who regulate the space, the general kind of ecosystem of the Indian digital landscape is going to exert more and more of a gravitational pull on the character of some of these large tech companies that have had these a global reach as well.
So just a couple of follow-ups on
Sure.
that. I mean, you mentioned that the Indian government is, some of the principles it's following are based on looking out for its consumers in India, its citizenry, as it should. But it's very clearly, I mean, we've seen so many headlines in the last few months in India. They've been at loggerheads, some of the larger tech companies in India, over new rules that have come out. And several activists have also actually sided with the tech companies, questioning, or rather, instead of getting into who they're siding with, they've questioned the government's rules, they've questioned the government's stance, because they don't think it's in the best interest of the users, of the citizens, right? So how is that tension playing out, and what does that mean for doing business in India for these companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, that tension is playing out in almost every, different space that we see, which is, you see it most acutely, as you kind of alluded to, in the social media space. You're seeing it in e-commerce. You're seeing it in everything from kind of cloud infrastructure as it relates to, startups having access to the technologies they want, issues like data localization and kind of intermediary liability that have been swirling for some time. So this is one of those central tensions. I think the Indian government has staked out a position that, we as a democratic government kind of know best in terms of how to protect the interests of our people. And, I think that puts tech companies in a very tricky position sometimes. And we're seeing this in the way that, as you alluded to, NGOs and civil society leaders have, in some sense, in some select cases, back the tech companies over the government, particularly on these issues around privacy and encryption, and it's created this odd odd alliance in some sense within the Indian market. I think in terms of how tech companies are viewing this, I'd say the the overall, you know, view of the market and kind of their view of the regulatory landscape is really mixed, right? There's significant interest in playing a larger and larger role in the Indian market. There's a strong belief that India could be the single largest driver of growth in the coming decades, right? But that optimism, in one sense, is also balanced against this increasing wariness of, the role of this government, the ideology of this government, and how that manifests in shaping regulatory policy right now. The amount of political hostility that's demonstrated towards American tech companies, I think, is something that has caught folks by, not necessarily surprise, but it's certainly caught their attention. And there's this view that India is moving forward with these regulations and political pressures that are fundamentally punitive, that are politically motivated in some cases, and not necessarily pragmatic when it comes to solving underlying issues, whether on encryption, whether on kind of e-commerce and whatnot. So there is this frustration, I would say, that's building, I think, in the civil society side of things, but then also within the companies in terms of where the arc of policy is headed.
How do you see that resolving? I mean, since you mentioned that, India is going to be the next big driver of growth for practically all the tech companies, just because of the sheer size of the market and the fact that China has walled off to them, right?
Right.
So how is that growth versus the hostility, or how is that going to play out? Are the companies going to focus on revenue, sales growth, and hence, fall in line with the government's demands? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, this is, I would say the multi-billion-dollar question that every tech company and every CEO is grappling with. And I think it's important to, I think zoom out a bit and think not just about India in isolation, but this is this globalized economy that the companies are operating in and making their kind of investment decisions as well, thinking about the values and kind of how stances that they take in India impact kind of their ability to take stances elsewhere, whether it's in Europe, in the United States, and vice versa. So it's as with almost everything in the digital world, there's this element of kind of interactivity there. And I would say private companies, kind of at their core, will obviously focus on making profits, making kind of revenue, and continuing to see return on investment in the Indian market.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that it's not inherently bad in any way, right? And this is something that the Indian government itself, when it talks about what it wants to do in the digital space, when it talks about wanting to source investment, has in many ways welcomed to a certain extent. The challenge, of course, is that at the same time that it's trying to court, foreign investment, it's putting up, a number of these, walls and kind of regulatory architecture that is, I think viewed, at least from the outside, as, solely geared towards building up domestic companies and keeping, foreign companies at bay.
Mm.
And how do we know this, right? Indian policy documents, if you look at them, they're saying this quite explicitly, right? So promoting domestic companies, oftentimes at the singular expense of foreign companies, is a goal of Indian policy, full stop, right? But now let's unpack that a bit. Any country would naturally want to grow out its domestic digital ecosystem, right? They want to grow homegrown tech companies that deliver world-class innovation, and that's really a legitimate objective for public policy. But there's this difference between, I'd say, bolstering the Indian technology sector and picking and choosing winners through policy or ring fencing certain sectors to benefit, one or two or three specific companies. And I can think of several Indian companies and entrepreneurs who might take issue with that approach as well, right? Tech policy also has kind of a bearing on several other key Indian objectives. For example, India has geopolitical objectives. It wants to strengthen ties with the United States, Japan, Europe, counter Chinese influence in the digital domain. And so, if you're constantly going after foreign companies, there is going to be a geopolitical kind of cost that comes with that trade-off as well. India also has commercial objectives, right? As I mentioned earlier, it wants to source foreign investment. It needs kind of foreign investors to play a role in the economy, grow jobs. It also wants to have its IT services companies and technology companies go abroad and succeed, right? And so there is this question of, what happens if the rest of the world starts reciprocating against India with certain elements, whether it's on data localization, whether it's on taxation. At this moment, I think we're entering this interesting inflection point for India where, you're seeing Indian startups, IPO, go public, making acquisitions of companies, of US companies, right? In the case of Baiju. And so, I think Indian companies are, at this interesting moment where they could go global. They're starting to go global. And, I think there hasn't necessarily been the introspection to think, how does the policies and the way that we treat the rest of the world impact the way the rest of the world will treat us when our companies go abroad? So that's sort of the second piece. And then the third kind of important piece related to this is the development objectives, right? India has staked this claim to want to accelerate the pace of digitization, to boost financial inclusion, to promote ease of living across the country as soon as possible. And when that is, you see the power of technology and its ability to kind of change the lives of people, bring them into this modern digital economy, provide e-governance services. This is something that's really an all hands on deck effort. And to say that, only domestic companies should be the ones really operating here, and that, foreign companies have no role to play, or, just from a prescriptive standpoint, should not have a role to play in this kind of broader project, I think, is ultimately something that, cuts against this broader project, and India's own objectives to develop the country as well.
So the consumers end up being the losers.
Yeah, I think I would think about the way that the Indian market and consumer has benefited from this, diverse ecosystem. The entire Indian e-commerce, right, in many ways was brought up by this mix of, domestic players, but foreign players, whether it's, Amazon or now Walmart on Flipkart or the rest, bringing kind of cutting edge innovation to the market, helping grow the market and scale, whether it's Uber, spawning, competitors with Ola or whatnot. So there's this interplay of competition, right, that is taking place that, I think ultimately is for the benefit to Indian consumers as well, in terms of their access to cutting edge services and products, in terms of kind of competition, in terms of pricing, in terms of kind of new innovations that are happening locally as well, in terms of kind of the talent wars and the buildup of local ecosystems where, coders and people who bring that expertise now have the option of, starting their own company, joining an Indian firm, going to a multinational. And so the result of that is something that I think ultimately benefits, the Indian digital ecosystem and the Indian consumer writ large. And too often I think when we think about tech policy and tech policy that benefits India, it's viewed through this lens of what benefits Indian firms, not what benefits Indian consumers and kind of India as a whole.
So Anand, I'm going to push you a little bit on your comments on competition. If the Indian government is introducing policies to support a domestic industry, isn't that better for the consumers, because that industry can grow up to compete with the foreign tech players over here? Isn't that just better for the consumers in the long run?
Well, it's a question of, what is ultimately better for the consumer, in terms of their access to cutting edge services, right? In terms of, is there necessarily anything inherently, from a consumer standpoint, is there anything inherently better to having a product from a Indian company versus a, foreign company? I think if you're a consumer, you just kind of want the best product, right? You want the product that gets you to where you need to go, the product that connects you to to the internet and to your friends, to your communities and whatnot, right? So, and also a product that reflects your values. So I would say from a consumer standpoint, I think, it's a bit more, I think I would say rational, right? Which is, what is the best product that enables me to do the things that I want to do kind of in my everyday? Um, and I'd say when it
Right.
goes to the level of a government, that's where these issues around, values and the long-term value generation in the ecosystem, creating a domestic tax base, creating companies that, I think, at least rightly or wrongly, are perceived to be more aligned with Indian interest and, more willing to cooperate with the Indian government. That's where I think the Indian view of, promoting the advantages of promoting homegrown sector start to be a little bit clearer. but there is this tension between kind of consumer focused innovation and long term kind of
Mm-hmm.
building up of this domestic tech ecosystem that will continue to shape policy. I think as I don't know if this you know as I was saying before, there is again this difference between building a domestic tech ecosystem um, and also building up specific champions, right? I think that singling out one or two companies for as the nominal Indian alternative here, or and sometimes trying to create an Indian platform that whether it's in e-commerce or other places that effectively create choke points, right? It doesn't allow free flowing innovation, companies to kind of create their own integrated business operations. It all has to be on one common platform that links everyone. There are pluses and minuses to this approach that I think are starting to bear out in many ways as well.
And you've raised a lot of great points today, and I have one final question for you before I let you go.
Sure.
In the background of everything that we've spoken about, if you had to take a step back, where do you see this headed? Do you have any predictions on how this is going to play out?
I'd say looking at kind of at the global level, the big question for every one of these companies is going to be, okay, if we can't make inroads in China, and if this broader notion of US-China competition is going to continue to shape the global ecosystem, where do we go, right? In terms of our investment, in terms of the technologies that we prioritize, in terms of our kind of distributed focus and kind of global focus. So that is one of the big, I think, meta questions that I think will continue to unfold over the coming years. The second one that is related to this is this goes back to our discussion on technology and ideology, which is I think companies are going to have to determine with a little bit more precision what their values are and how they shape their values to local context. There's this fundamental tension between wanting to be a universal platform, connect the world across different jurisdictions, across different communities, right? And wanting to, I think, adapt your values to a local communities and context. So that interplay, I think, is something that every tech company is going to have to make some hard choices internally in terms of the values that they view as kind of non-negotiable core, and then also their own broader kind of strategic and business objectives as they're looking to scale globally. The third piece, I think, is, as we alluded to, the emergence of the Indian tech sector as they start to, this new generation of homegrown entrepreneurs and innovators that are able to bring talent, start their own businesses, infuse capital into this sector and really compete at a global level like they've already done, right? Where does this generation of folks go push the boundaries of technology innovation? And I think what you'll start to see is a ecosystem where Indian entrepreneurs start to go global and really take the world by storm. It's already happening, right? But I look forward to the day when we in America can look at Indian companies that are starting to make inroads and bring some of that homegrown innovation, whether it's in terms of digital payments or commerce, to the United States and to other places in around the world. So that's sort of the third kind of element of this. And the fourth and final one that I think I would say is just what's going to happen in terms of data data governance. Whether it's the U.S., whether it's India. We've seen the Biden administration make this push for a global kind of digital trade type of deal, and that's something that's kind of in the works right now, at least on our side, and being hotly
Right.
debated. But in the coverage of it, at least so far, the one country that's always left out of these discussions is India, right? There's this, I think, this worry that India, if it were included as part of this, would ultimately tank the negotiations, or alternatively, it would be hard for the Biden administration to really take it forward. And so I think if that is the approach that's taken, you enter this interesting kind of outcome where the largest digital player in Asia outside of China is outside of kind of both ecosystems that is coming together, which is the Chinese digital ecosystem and kind of this American kind of Indo-Pacific ecosystem. And so the key question for India is going to be, how do you operate? How do you navigate these emerging forces? And, do you pick a side or not, or do you move forward with, as, the foreign minister puts it, the India way? And, I think it's ultimately going to be some elements of both across all three of these. But, it's one of the most exciting questions for, watchers of Indian tech policy.
Got it. Combination of the India way and values versus profits. That's what it sounds like.
I would say so as well.
Thank you so much for your time today, Anand. Really appreciate all your insights.
Thanks, Megha. Wonderful to be here.